Okay, good evening, everybody. This is part two of our two-part series. Tonight, we're going to talk about Turkey, the key to an untraditional Thanksgiving. And I was debating about this. I thought, do I want to talk about this topic before or after Thanksgiving? But I feel like by talking about it before Thanksgiving, it'll give enough time for people to sort out their respective positions about things. Give me 1 second here. There we go. So let's just talk through a few things here. So last week, when we were discussing about exotic animals and kashrus, one of the ideas that was brought up by the Shach, and he related it to birds, which is what we're going to talk about this evening, was a notion of Masorah and tradition. And so that is going to be a focus of what we're going to try to talk about. Those of you familiar with this topic know that when it comes to the question of Turkey, the question of Masorah might play an important role. We're going to see about that. And there's a couple amazing articles, and I wanted to call one of them out that I used in preparing this. And this comes from Rabbi Zivotofsky. He wrote literally the Bible of Turkey as being kosher. And this is in his intro, and I want to read it to you because I think that it sets the stage up for us well. So with Columbus' serendipitous discovery of the quote-unquote New World came not only the blessing of a new land in which Jews would find a safe haven, but also unknown species of flora and fauna with which the halachic system would have to deal. In other words, we have a system of rules and regulations and traditions that all of a sudden, there's a brand new area that we discovered. We need to figure out how to relate to that. Imagine, for instance, if today we started living in another area that we never lived in before, that was uninhabited, like Mars or I don't know what, it would be a similar question. So Turkey, a new world bird, is a good example of this. According to the National Turkey Federation, Israel leads the world in turkey consumption. So we know that Jewish people enjoy turkey at a whopping 26.9 pounds per capita in 1996. I think the numbers probably have only gone up since then. Israelis consume about 45% more turkey than Americans, and who are the world's #2 consumers. So how is it that the turkey, the quintessential New World species, which, by the way, Benjamin Franklin proposed as the national bird of the United States, has become so universally accepted as a kosher species that Israel leads the world in its consumption? And to appreciate the question, one must understand how fowl are classified as permissible or forbidden, and to recognize why a quote-unquote new species of fowl presents a significant halachic challenge. And so that's exactly what we're going to do tonight. We're going to try to understand on the most basic level a huge sugya as it comes to the kashrus of birds, and try to pick up on the way the foundational tools that we'll need to be able to answer not just questions about turkey, but all other exotic dishes as well, so we can decide whether or not we can eat it on Thanksgiving. And the best place to start is in the primary sources of the Torah itself, where we have both, you notice in Vayikra and in Devarim, side by side. And I see a few other people just joined, so let me just resend these source sheets into the chats over here. Hopefully that came through. Both in Vayikra, Perek Yud Aleph, and Devarim, Perek Yud Daled, you'll notice that there is a list here. But these you shouldn't eat. They're an abomination: the eagle, the vulture, the black vulture. Bet hadaya, bet hayalamina, bet kol rimino, bet batayana, bet hatachmas the shachab, bet nislimineu, bet akos bet hashalach, bet hayanshuf, bet tinshama, bet akat veracham, bet hachasidan, and nafal mina, bet duchlipat, bet hatalif. And you'll see a very similar list in Devarim as well. And these are lists of 24 animals, 24 species of birds, which are not kosher. The Torah is explicit, unlike what we saw before when it came to animals, where the Torah just gave us general rubrics, didn't give us a whole list of animals that were not kosher. So here, it gave us a few examples, and we said that those examples came to prove the rules about other things, like a camel or a pig teaches us about chewing cud and split hooves. And so same idea, and same thing with the shafan. But in this case, the Torah is very explicit. This was my bar mitzvah parsha, Parshas Rei, not Shmini. And you can imagine how hard it was to learn these words and these 24 species of birds. It wasn't easy. But here we have all 24 species of birds. So this should be very simple. It should be very pashut. The Torah tells us these are the birds that your person cannot eat. These are not acceptable. And therefore, everything else, the implication would be, is in fact something good for us to eat. And in fact, the Rashi on the bottom here in source number 4 tells us this explicitly. Just look in the bold part for a moment. The reason why the Torah gives us a list simply of the birds that are not kosher is to basically tell us that the birds that are kosher are much more are in the majority. So therefore, the Torah tells us simply the minority. Now, so what's the obvious problem here? So if we know the animals, we know the birds, so we should be able to answer things accordingly. Now, when it comes to turkey, that's a whole other problem, which is like in the time of the Torah, there was no turkeys, because again, it's a bird from the New World. But what emerges, though, is that with time, we have a hard time translating exactly what these birds are. In fact, take a look at how ArtScroll translates it. And this actually, I know sometimes we like to pile on ArtScroll. This is interesting. Notice how ArtScroll translates it. Look in the English here. I just like took a snapshot. So it says the nesher, the paris, the ozniah, the dayan, ha'aya. Notice that it doesn't translate it. Correct. You'll notice that ArtScroll doesn't translate it at all. Why do you think ArtScroll doesn't translate it? It's because we're not exactly clear what these animals are. And so if ArtScroll were to translate this the way that I believe this is a JPS translation above, a person might take that literally, might open up the Chamesh, might go out to their like local aviary or to the woods or something like that, look up certain birds and say, oh, not on the list, I can go eat it. And so like the ArtScroll is being extra careful not to define them because we're not exactly sure what all these are. In other words, we assume that a nesher is an eagle and a paris and a ozniah are a vulture and a black vulture, but exactly which species, genome, et cetera, we're not exactly clear on this. And for this reason, it creates ambiguity, which is where, as we know, the Torah Sheba'al Peh is going to play an important role to help us define it. There's an incredible Ibn Ezra that I want to share with you from Vayikra on these psukim over here. Take a look on box number 5. So Ibn Ezra points something out. He says, Amrat Tzedukim. So what is the duchipat? What is this this bird? So he says, the duchipat, the Tzedukim seshi hartarnagolas. This is a chicken, a tarnagolet, we know. And what does he say? This is like, only the Ibn Ezra could get away with this. Can you imagine in today's like political climate saying something like this? He says what? And these are the greatest idiots, the greatest fools, right? Who told them that this is a chicken? In other words, the Sadducees, they did not, the Karaites, they did not eat chicken because it's listed according to their tradition. It's simply listed as something that is not included in the list of kosher birds. It's listed explicitly as a not kosher bird. So if that's your tradition, not only do you have different customs relative to like what we call normative rabbinic Judaism, but you didn't even get to eat chicken, which is kind of a missed opportunity for you. In any case, the Mishnah in Chulin, again, should be hopefully a little bit known to some of you, comes along and helps us fill in the blanks because we don't know exactly. So when the Torah lists these 24 birds that are not kosher, is there something specific about them that makes them not kosher? Or alternatively, is this just a general list? And if we were to find other birds, that they would be kosher, or do those other birds have to fit into other rubrics as well? And so the Mishnah in Chulin tells us as follows. And by the way, like this Mishnah and the Gemara in Chulin, like we can spend literally we can spend a year on it. So Simanei Be'ema B'chaim Nemrim B'Torah. So when it comes to Simanim, we said last week, those Simanim are actually taught to us in the Torah. The simanei ha'ov lo nemru. However, when it comes to simanim of a bird, it's not taught. So aval amru chachamim. So the chachamim say what? Kol of hadores tameh. Any bird that is dores. Now I'm going to translate that word as bird of prey. That's how I want to translate it. But we're going to have to define that because again, it's not defined. Kol of hadores is tameh. That is automatically considered a tameh, impure bird. Kol sheishel etzba yatera, any bird that has an extra finger, not a finger, they're not fingers, like a toe, that's the word I'm looking for, behind their legs, right? Then that would be yatera, v'zefek, v'kor kivano niklaf, and it also has, in addition to having an extra toe, it also has a crop. And it also has a gizzard, which can be like peeled, tahor. Those are tahor. In other words, how would we be able to tell if it has an extra digit? We can tell by looking at the bird. How can we tell about the gizzard and the crop? Well, if you look at the picture of the chicken, I never thought I would put a picture of a chicken on a source sheet, but you can notice that we have here, you can see the innards, you can see the gizzard, and you can see the crop. All birds have a gizzard, but not all of them have a peelable gizzard. And so that's like the important part here. And sometimes it can be hard to identify and sometimes hard to see as well. You can see here, this is a chicken, which we know to be kosher. And if you look at its leg, you'll also notice it has like the extra hind toe, though that is, according to the Mishnah, the three categorical things that a bird needs to have in order to be kosher. Now, when we go back, and Rav Elazar bar Tzadok says any bird that splits the digits of its feet, its toes, when standing on a string, again, so that's not a non-kosher bird, and we'll just put that on the side for now. Let's go back to this Mishnah, though, and try to read the Mishnah and try to understand what the Mishnah here is telling us here. When it says kol of hadores tameh, well, number one, what is the problem with a predatory bird? Number one. Number two, how did Chazal know? Maybe it's a tradition, Moshe Messinai, but how did Chazal in fact know that that dores, predatory birds are a problem? So Tosfos and Chulin asks this question. How could they have known this, right? Are they some type of experts when it comes to birds that the rabbis knew, right? How could they know this? So you look in the Yesh Lomer, Shema Kabbalah Haita. Where might we know this from? It's a Kabbalah mimos Noach shehikriv miko'of tahor badaket kulam umasar darot shein of tahor dores. How do we know about dores as a fact that automatically a dores animal, a dores bird, has to not be kosher? Well, it must be in the Torah from the very first zoologist, Noach himself. Noach went and he sacrificed all the tahor, all the birds who are pure. And he was able to identify, he wrote it all down, and he shared it down for generations and generations. And so we already start to see here like this notion of like information being passed on from generation to generation. Yeah.
Does that assume that the word tahor?
No, no, it's not, no. Correct. Yeah, the point that, yes, tahor doesn't necessarily mean kosher. Yeah, it's complex. Yeah, point taken, 100%. And what is the problem theoretically with a predatory bird? Like, what could the problem be? So the Ramban has a famous idea when it comes to how we define kashrus. Like when we try to explain, like, why do we eat kosher? So what's the answer? So the Ramban has this beautiful idea, and it expands. I'm just giving you pieces of it. He says that Torah that the Torah takes away from us animals that are predatory. Why? We don't want to eat it because its blood becomes heated up due to its cruelty, and it's dark and thick, which gives rise to the bitter, the fluid in the body, which is mostly black and tends to make the heart cruel. What is the Ramban saying here? That if you eat animals that are predators, or in particular predatory birds, that you might come to take on those character traits. It will turn your heart black. It will hurt you in some right? And so, so if we know for sure the animal is not dores, it's not predatory, so then for sure it's okay. But the Inya Hadrisa who Hatzad side, she drove halafot, how do we define it? It means that they hunt for food, they chase after other birds, catch them alive, and press at them with its claws and eat them. And we'll come to that in a minute, which is like, how do we define the word? Like, how do we define dores? Like, how does this make sense? But what's important for us at this point is to highlight that there are potentially two different ways for us to read this Mishnah. And again, we're going to come back to it. One way we read the Mishnah is that kol of hadores, that any animal that's predatory is tameh, which means that if it's not dores, are these three next categories of things, meaning the extra toe, the zafak, and the kurkavan, are those the definition of a non-dores bird? Or in reality, are there four different rules and simanim when it comes to a bird? Everyone understand what I'm saying? When you read this Mishnah, We can read it in different ways, and this actually becomes a big machlokas in the Meforshim. But before we get there, let's go and further define what we mean by doreis. So how do we define it? So the Bartanura in the Chulin gives us two different possibilities in source number 9. So hadoreis. So one is that it refers to ha'oches b'tzipornav u'magbiya min akarka ma shehuocha. How do we know if an animal is a doreis? It takes with its nails and lifts the food off from the ground that's going to eat. That's one possibility. But Yesh Shapir show others suggest what's the second possibility? You know an animal, a bird, is going to be doreis if it's going to eat its food while it's still alive, while it's still living, right? So think about like, again, I don't know a lot about birds, like a hawk, I'm imagining, like an eagle, right? Those are predatory birds. They go, like, do they first kill the animal and then eat it, or they like take a chunk out of the animal and that's what kills the animal? I'm assuming it's the latter. So that's one possibility. The Rambam parish on the Mishnayos has a slightly different interpretation. You see here, etc. That he like puts his hands on it, holds on his food, and then takes and puts into his mouth, possibly even like breaking a piece off for it. And there's all these different ways that we can read this. Tosfos, for example, says similarly to like the Bartanura, and you can see this here, right? That like you look on the last 3 words on the first line, similar to the Bartanura's second interpretation, that like we define doreis as eating an animal, eating your food before it is dead itself. Again, so lots of different ways. Others suggest that it has to do with like, think about like, I always think of like snakes that use like its venom, or like that it like will like physically kill the animals with its talons or something like that, or maybe it has to do with seizing animals in flight. We have all these different simanim, but when all these different ways to define what doreis means. Let's go back to the question I just asked, which is, so then how does doreis, now that we've defined doreis in these different ways that have to do with the predatory type of eating that the bird does, what then is the relationship between these different simanim? Are there in fact 4 simanim, or are there really 3 simanim? Again, is doreis its own siman, or is doreis the category? And non-doreis, we would know it was non-doreis if it had these following 3. You can read it in different ways. So let's look at Rashi in Chulin. Rashi tells us, box number 12. So Rashi tells us that what? V'areisha samich, the tanale ko'of hadoreis tameh v'im eno doreis, v'yesh lo od shlosha simanim, dehavu arba'a b'yadua shehu tahor. According to Rashi, how many simanim do we need to make sure that it's tahor? We need all 4. The 3 that the Mishnah tells us, and we have to make sure that it is a non-doreis type animal. So that is how Rashi tells us. Rashi's opinion that it's all 4 is necessary. Now, what happens if like we just don't know about the animal? This is an interesting question. What happens in a situation where we're just not familiar with the animal, and so we don't know if it's a doreis or a non-doreis? According to Rashi, you need all those things. We can identify whether a bird has an extra digit by looking at the bird. We can look at the peelable gizzard by shechting it, removing the gizzard. We can look to see if it has a crop when we open up the bird itself. But if we, like I just defined for you, a doreis could mean all different types of things. And so how do we know if this animal is a doreis or is a non-doreis? According to Rashi, all 4 of those are required. And so look at the Gemara in Chulin in the next box. The Gemara in Chulin asks a question, or implies to us something interesting here. This is Amar Abaye, Tarnagola de Agma Chad Meshwana Sveikosu. There is something called a swamp rooster. It's one of 8 uncertain cases that we don't know about. And this is the Marda, which is mentioned earlier in the Gemara. Amar Papa Tarnagola de Agma Asira. The swamp rooster is forbidden, but Tarnagola de Agma Sharia. But the swamp hen, on the other hand, is permitted. Now, what is the biological difference between a swamp rooster and a swamp hen? I don't know. But this is like great. You got to love this. The Gemara always trying to give you like a couple of tips and tricks here to remember something. So V'simanecha, how would you know whether like to remember that the swamp rooster and the swamp hen are different, right? That the swamp rooster is forbidden, but the swamp hen is permissible. So the answer is the Torah tells us Ammoni below Ammonit. In other words, that like a male descendant from Ammon cannot enter into the Jewish people, but a female can. In other words, the female, the swamp hen is okay, but the male not so much. And so it's just an interesting way to say this, right? And so what we see here is there's like this uncertainty about the swamp rooster, where at first we were unsure about what it was, and then the swamp hen says that it's good, and the Gemara later on is actually tell us that the swamp hen actually is also not good because the swamp hen was trampling on its food and eating it as well. And so what do we see here? So it was like trampling its food, and so it was like defined as a doreis. So what we see here is that there can be situations where we're not sure about what happens. And in theory, by watching the animal and watching the bird, our opinions might change. So that's what motivates Rashi to tell us something enormous. This is like probably the most important source, which is source 14. Ra'u chachamim shedoreset va'ochelat v'hainu giruta de amrina. This is referring over here. Lekaman berkol basar aser lam giruta sharalan. There was aser and it was permitted, right? Lishna de kavra shetamu ketamo. And so umatoch she'ein anu b'kiin b'ham. Because we actually don't know this. We're not experts. I mean, again, I don't know, maybe someone on Zoom or someone here in person is an expert in birds. I'm not. And I'll bet that most of us are not. And even like those who are like professional shoftim are also probably not experts in birds. So we're not experts, right? Nearly to ofa balafanenu, if we see a bird in front of us, they shalmar, shemed yidros, we want to know is it a doris or not, the hahach, tarnagola de agma, hayuma chaziki mator, achar zman reusha de resed, vein of nachalanu, elabim sorot. Right, of shemasru, lanu labotenu, betawer, v'shalov masru lanu yesh lachush v'sorot, yesham nismoch. And so what he says here is that we don't know. And so what must we rely on? We have to rely on a Masorah. We have to rely on a tradition. And he also includes an important word here when it says tradition. Where does the tradition need to come from? It needs to come from where? Me avotenu. It needs to come from our forefathers, from our predecessors. Now that's like I'm foreshadowing a little bit because that word could mean lots of things. Does Rashi mean that like, if my father told me that this is good, then it's good? Or must the Masorah go back many, many, many generations for it to be good or not? This is very relevant to our discussion, for instance, about a turkey. Columbus doesn't come to America till 1492, I think, right? So, I mean, yes, it's been a minute since that happened, but it's not like it's as long as the chicken, right? So this is a very significant point that we have to figure out.
Does he give an example of any type of animal that they ate because of Masorah?
No, not Rashi doesn't give an opinion. No, but we're going to see how other holds like this. So again, let's just put Rashi's opinion together because all these pieces help us see like a very clear image for Rashi's opinion. Rashi says for a bird to be kosher, it needs to have not only the 3 positive signs, it also has to be a non-doreis, right? Because he understands that all those 4 together. And in addition to that, because it can be very difficult for us to know whether or not an animal is doreis or not, in addition, we need, I would call it like a 5th thing, which is we need a Masorah. We need all those things together. Now, the idea, by the way, of Masorah, unlike what we said last week with the shach, the shach comes from left field and says, by the way, I think animals should also have a Masorah like birds do. And the shach comes and enters this idea. This idea of Masorah is not some far-fetched idea that Rashi comes up with. The Gemara itself talks about the notion of Masorah. For example, Amar B'Yitzchak, Ov Tahor Nachal Masoras, right? So a bird can be eaten on the strength of a tradition that's kosher, right? Ne'emanat Tzayad Lomar, Ov Zat Tahor. I can trust the hunter to tell me that it was good. So again, like this notion that Rashi is telling us that we need a Masorah is very important because it helps us understand the fact that we really don't know what animals are doreis and what animals are not doreis. But the notion that he is adding here about the importance of Masorah and how Masorah can impact our decisions, actually is not unique. It comes back from the Gemara itself. And this is why when we look at birds, Masorah is so much more important than we look at Masorah when it comes to animals like we saw last week, the giraffe, the zebu, and others.
It says, Masa no Rebbe, in other words, it's the teacher and not the parent. Is that specific?
No, I don't think there's a... Yeah, someone shared it with him. Correct. Yeah, correct. So this is Rashi's opinion. That's one opinion. And again, I'm just trying to like build the sugya for you. So now let's introduce a second opinion, which is the second way to look back at the Mishnah in Chulin, which is the Aruch HaShulchan brings down the opinion here of Rav Moshe Bar Yosef. So O Chita Yesh Lachad Mervuta Shalia Hiskimu Rov Rabotinu. So he brings down this other opinion here that it's followed by many poskim. He shitat. Like I said, this is Rav Moshe ben Rav Yosef. O sheyesh lo gimel simanim shebegufohu vadai tahor. What do we need here? We don't need all four ideas here. Like I said, that's the second way of reading it. If the animal has three signs, then we know by definition that it is not dores. This is very significant because if we know whether it is dores or not, then having the Masorah is an important element, but the Masorah is not nearly as important because we can actually identify it based on the simanim. We can look at the gizzard, the toe, and look at the situation. So again, according to Rav Moshe Bar Yosef, none of the non-kosher birds on the Torah's list over here, none of them possess all three signs. And if a bird possesses all three of these good signs, then that means that it must be, by definition, non-predatory. It must be a non-dores. Now, this is a matter of like, again, we would have to, this is where it does get tricky. I want to like be intellectually honest to say that the only way to know if this is true is if we knew all 24 birds on the list from the Torah. And if we knew exactly which birds it were, then we'd be able to go and double check to make sure this opinion was correct. This is why it's like a little bit, so like the role of Masorah also kind of plays a role in the second opinion that like, we need to be able to prove this point by having Masorah about which birds the Torah tells us are not kosher to prove that none of them, in fact, have all three simanim to tell us that they're non-predatory birds. And so this is complex. And so if you flip over, I had to like mess it out of order because, yeah.
You know anything else about this person?
I don't offhand. You just quoted, yeah. Okay. I don't have no offhand. But if you flip over to source 17, you'll see the Shulchan Aruch over here. So Shulchan Aruch, I mean, again, it's very lengthy. There's a lot there's a whole simon here that we can look through. But again, simanei of tahor loni parish mator ella mina minim tmeim bilbad ushar minei ha'of mutarim aminim asurim kafdal, right? So there's 24 types, etc. Komi shu baki bota minim uishmotem ariza ochal ko'of sheino mehem. So if you are a baki, you know the 24, you're good to go. You can eat anything that's not, right? Right? So what do we see here immediately? Who is Rashi? Whose opinion is the Mechaber seem to follow? He seems to be following the opinion of Rashi a little bit here, right? We need a Masorah. Which is the Ov Tahor, V'neman Sai Lamar Ovza Hitirli Rabbi Hatzai, just like we saw in the Gemara, V'husha Yuchsa Koto Tzai. But this person has to be somebody who we can trust to tell us that this hunting rabbi needs to tell us that it's okay. It needs to be okay. So so if we don't know the animals, you have to be bodek. We have to check the simanim. If you don't know if it's a dores, this last opinion in the Mishnah we skipped over, etc., etc. Let's go down to Gimel number 3. So Yeshamrim Shako Of Shechartumo Rachav Kaf Rago Rachba Kashel Abaz Biadua Sheno Dores Mutar Bachila. There are those who say that all birds that have a wide beak and the palm of its foot is wide like a goose. This is the goose rule, which will play a role in a few minutes. Right. So these are all okay. Imesh Lo Shosha Simanim Begufo, as long as it has these 3 simanim. Haga, however, the Ramah tells us this is important for us, the Ashkenazim. We should not rely on this. The fact that there's a goose rule here that follows these three simanim. Why? The Ramah could not be more explicit. He holds explicitly when it, like Rashi. And what is the implication here of Rashi? That you need a Masorah. Without a Masorah, it's not good. Period. And so that is our practice. Without a Masorah, we cannot accept a bird to be a bird that we can eat. So let's now spend a minute thinking about Masorah for a second, which is, well, okay. So if we know that, I just spent the last, X number, a few minutes talking about that we need a Masorah. I've proven to Rashi is how we hold, so if you through the sugya. Well, when it comes to Masorah, is that something that can be transferred from community to community? Let's say, again, we've got the internet where everyone knows everything and people are going to watch this year from who knows where in the world, right? But if I was living in a little shtibel and we had a Masorah that this bird was okay, and then you were living in shtibel over there, and you came to visit for Shabbos and I served this food, can I eat that food? Is the Masorah unique to can I, if they say the Masorah is good, does that apply to everybody? Is it unique to them? Does it transfer? How many generations back must the Masorah go? What are the parameters of Masorah? This is important here because, again, we need to be able to identify, is a turkey kosher or not? And so there are many questions when it comes to Masorah. Again, if you go back to your sources, you can see here the Tshuva of the Rush, really worthwhile reading, but we'll skip for time. The Rush says that not all Masorahs are actually equal. And before you rely on any local Masorah for anything, you need to figure out, is it a long-standing tradition? You need to figure out whether there is a contrary negative Masorah that says the opposite. In other words, it's one thing for a community just not to have a Masorah that bird X is kosher. But what happens if a community says that one community has a Masorah that it is a not kosher bird, and this community says that it is a kosher bird? That's different than this community just doesn't know whether it is or isn't kosher, right? So the Rosh says not all Masorahs are equal. As an aside, this question of Masorah is really interesting and could be unpacked even further to think about some of the things that we take upon ourselves in our community, meaning the Orthodox, non-Orthodox, however you want to define it, community, the Masorah of how we act and how we define what is Masorah, and therefore this is how we do things, versus what are things that in fact can be adapted and changed. There's a lot, I think, to unpack here about Masorah. I'm just mentioning this to kind of put it on the side here. So that's the Chuvas Arash in box number 18. If you look in box 19, the Aruch HaShulchan here says, interestingly, Mishahu b'makom shnagim iser b'of echad mibnei she'enam Masorah. So again, you go and you're, again, this is exactly the case they're talking about. Someone that doesn't have a specific Masorah on a bird and would normally not eat it, right? And he goes somewhere else, can he or can he not eat it, right? And so he says as follows, you can go there and eat it even though it's, not your Masorah. You can take it home. No, while you're there, right? It's not that we're saying that it's usher. We're saying that it probably is kosher. When we say that we don't eat a specific bird, it doesn't mean that it's not kosher. It's just not something that we don't have a Masorah for. I remember growing up, I used to hear this all the time from my father. He'd say, I'm not saying that it's wrong to do this. It's just not something that we do. It's not our practice. That's not how we do. I remember growing up, there are all types of things. My friends wanted to do certain things on Shabbos. My dad said, it's not that it's forbidden to do it on Shabbos. It's just not a way how we act. It's just not our Masorah. It's not how we look at things. Same idea. It doesn't mean that it's usher. It doesn't mean it's forbidden, this bird. It just means we don't have a Masorah for it. And so that's why the Aruch HaShulchan says perhaps we could, in fact, be a little bit more makel. I want to just keep moving here because we're going to run out of time. You can look in box 20 on the next page. There's a great Tosfos here that proves that the names themselves of the animals change over time. And because if the names change, that's why Masorah is even more important. And just because you have a Masorah for a specific bird, again, bird X, doesn't mean that bird X from 200 years ago is the same bird today. that may also, again, interestingly, could relate also to the notion of like evolution as well. Like birds can change also, right? And so how much of a Masorah can you apply a Masorah from one bird to the next bird? And this actually came up in a really fascinating point. If you turn over, it doesn't have a box, but it's the page that looks different than everything else. There's a fascinating case study about what happens if we come across a bird that looks something, it looks like a duck, but we're not sure it's a duck. Is it kosher? And this is a really cool Shilos and Chuvos from Yisachar Dov Lowy, who came to New Orleans in 1862. And you can see on the right, this is his like tshuva. This is like, he's writing this tshuva, and he eventually sends it to Samson Far Hirsch. The response from Rabbi Samson Far Hirsch is on the top left. It's like really cool stuff here. I was able to find it. I was really excited to see this. And so he tells a story that Bayom HaShlishi Leviato, V'nei Nikraiti Lechol Lechim Mechad Mo'avei Mo'avai V'voi Lechatzer Beito. I was invited by a friend on the third day to go to his like courtyard of his house. Ra'iti Barvezet Shonat B'tzurot B'tzavran V'yan Gufo. I saw this different type of duck. A duck that I'd never seen before. Behem Nikrim Muscovy ducks. I love it, like when they write it in English like that. Like it just like, because how do you translate? How do you write that in Hebrew, right? So what does he do? You can read it. He asks the homeowner, like, what's the purpose of owning these ducks? And he replies that, well, we have them to eat them. And so he says, what's the basis for eating on those ducks? So he says, oh, well, like the chazan had a tradition that he learned from the previous chazan. He used to eat them in the Jewish community. You can scroll down. You can see Charleston and Jamaica. Like they had a custom to eat it there. So therefore, it was okay. And by the way, like they didn't have a rabbi at the time, was qualified, and like it's complicated because also like there was no rabbi in Charleston and Jamaica, but that was the tradition there. And it's even more interesting because like the previous chazan who was giving this Masorah himself wasn't Shomer Shabbos, and Shomer Shabbos at this time, and maybe even today, is like the defining like character trait of like Nemanos. And so he writes, Rav Lowy, that maybe he says, even though there seems to be some Masorah here, I don't know if I can trust that Masorah. I don't know if it's okay. And he sends it to Rav Hirsch, and Rav Hirsch, in fact, concurs that it's not that it is usher to eat the Muscovy duck, but in fact, the question of Masorah is not strong enough, even though this duck looks like other ducks. It's got a slightly different neck, but we don't want to do it. Rav Malkiel Tenenbaum, who lived also in like the late 1800s, and Divrei Malkiel Lier actually permitted them, saying that there's no difference. You can see this in the second paragraph. Uvaguf hadavar lemasa haminag po ochlam uchadat hamatirim. He says that we do eat them, and this is like if you relevant very much for Thanksgiving. I've never seen it, I've never had it, but I've heard of it. People like to have something called the turducken, where they take a turkey and put a duck inside the turkey and a chicken inside the duck, and they cook all those together. It's like a whole thing. It's called a turducken. You can Google it if you've never heard of it before. If nothing else, you learn something about Thanksgiving food. So this, not only do we learn about turkey, but even some duck could be very relevant halacha maisa for those who hold by turducken when it comes to Thanksgiving. And so we have, this is like a case study here of Masorah and whether or not it can easily be changed or not. So let's talk now Turkey for a minute. We just have a few minutes left. So Turkey, the history seems to be that people have been eating turkey for centuries. It's unclear, again, I'm not like, I don't know too much about the history, but I do know that turkeys came, we're not exactly sure when or where. Notice that, like, what's the Hebrew word for turkey in Hebrew? Hodu. And what is Hodu? India. Right? And so many thought this was like an Indian bird. So in the Hebrew gives way to where did this bird likely come from? They didn't see it. They thought it came from like India, right? And it's possible some people saw like North America as maybe like also like related to India in some way, or maybe it just came from India. There's a lot of history here. But the point is that it was eaten for many, many, many years. And so it wasn't a halachic concern until, I don't know when the first time someone asks about it, probably like 1800s or something like that, 19th century, that some people start to question whether or not we can eat the turkey. But for a number of centuries, Jews ate the turkey, period. It happened. So we now have a number of interesting dilemmas here. Number one, everybody's doing it. If everybody's doing it, does that make it okay? is that enough for a Masorah? We just tried defining Masorah. Like, is that the Masorah? Everyone's doing it? What about like someone had to be the first? Someone had to start it, right? So maybe that guy wasn't good, but everybody else was good, right? And so the Kaf HaChaim, he writes, he's back on the other page over here for a moment in box 24. He says, brings on a tradition in the Knesset Hagadola that Turkey has the signs of kashrus and is permitted. And he understands this to be, again, an Indian bird, which was actually eaten specifically where, if you look, again, I love it when they do this. The last line, Shazel Shekorino Topu Baghdad, that it originates from Baghdad, he says. That's what the Kaf HaChaim says. That's where it comes from. And the problem is that, like, we know that doesn't there, it actually originates from North America. So that actually calls into question, like, the Kaf HaChaim's approach that it is good, because if he's basing a Masorah on Baghdad, well, that's not where they come from. They come from North America, which means that whoever told the Kaf HaChaim that it was where it comes from, it was wrong, which means that the knowledge wasn't really there. And so we have others who tell us that it's no good. For example, Rav Shlomo Kluger in Chuvas Ha'alef, Shlomo over here on the bottom, source 25, says that's usher, and just the fact that people have Masorah in America to eat it is irrelevant, and ties it to the notion that there really isn't necessarily like an Adam Gadol who permitted it. There isn't great sages. This goes back to Rashi's like notion of me'avotenu, like it's got to be the key and real experts. Okay, it's nice that you're eating it. And by the way, he quotes the Shulchan Aruch and he quotes the Shach, source 26 and 27, and he doesn't hold like the Shach here, that Masorah doesn't go back to Yamim Kadmonim. Again, the Shach here talks about how far must the Masorah go back, again, for those who want to go deeper. But what I want to end with here is the Netziv, who also was asked this question. It's lived around the same time as Shlomo Kluger, and he has a very different approach. So the Netziv says as follows. Yeah, source 28, correct, source 28. So, v'teda sheheter ha'of indik sha'anu ochlim hayu harbe ma'arim alehem b'shah shehiduam me'idna v'lo haya Masorah al ksheratan. We had no Masorah that it was in fact kosher. V'gam od hayom yesh ma'achirim u'porshim mehem. Many people, it says they don't eat it. Or Shlomo Kluger, by the way, like the legend goes, like that Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, I think, didn't eat turkey. Someone, I think, once told me that it wasn't his minhag, it was his wife's minhag. So I think he told his children or grandchildren, like, I have to follow my wife, but like, don't take this on. Turkey is delicious, right? Or something like that. But he says, like, there are people in Machmir, Mikol Makom, the Netziv says, Kfar nagu lahater v'in potzepo, umishum shekfar huchzuku lahater v'in raya l'asra. How do we make sense of this? He's saying basically that, like, once people start doing it and say that it's okay, it must have to be okay. What are we going to do? Tell the whole world that they can't eat turkey? 45% the world's turkey goes to Israel. How are we supposed to make sense of this? So there's a few different ways that we could look at this. One possibility is that what the Netziv is trying to imply is that, remember, the Ramah lived after Columbus came to America. It's possible, definitely possible, that Columbus brought back turkeys with him to Spain. And it's possible already from there that there could have been a tradition before the Ramah said that you need to have all four things. It could have been that the tradition already existed. And once something is kind of like looped in and good, then it's okay. And this actually, we see this in a Gemara in the Chulin, and a Rosh had a comment about this, about whether or not the meat that was consumed in the Midbar before they come to Eretz Yisrael, which was like the limbs of the meat stabbing, that used with stabbing, could that be eaten? You could eat in the Midbar, you couldn't eat in Eretz Yisrael. So what about the leftovers you had from the previous night? Is it now usher from the second I cross over? Like something that once was kosher, but now is usher when I cross over to the other piece. Like what happened? So same idea. The turkey, if the turkey predates the Ramah and it already is there before the Ramah gets there, so therefore it must be good. But if the Ramah comes along and says, well, we don't have a Masorah for it, it's not good, does that retroactively make it not good or not? And this is what the Rosh says, like, who cares? What a crazy question for the Gemara to talk about. And the answer is it's very relevant for us. These are relevant questions. It's not, even though that in the Midbar is a once in a lifetime issue, this is about the status of whether something that was mutter after Gezerah is instituted. And so Rav Schachter writes that there probably is a sound svara that already in the time of the Ramah, that Jews are already eating turkey. based on its kosher simanim, without the extra chumrah of Rashi that we need a tradition, with it before the Ramah said it. And so therefore that made it okay before the Ramah writes opinions. That's one way we can read the Netziv. The second possibility is based on the other Gemara in Chulin in Daf Hamabet in box 31, that like if everyone's doing it, God wouldn't let righteous people like sin. And Tosos elsewhere says, and Gittin, like, don't think that doesn't mean that God says that like tzaddikim never make mistakes. But the point is that like if everybody's doing it, it's probably like God wouldn't let that happen, right? And then the last possibility here, as we think about our modern way of thinking, is that it's now been 5 centuries since we discovered the turkey, and we know that it's not a predatory bird. Like we've watched it, we've seen it. It's not predatory. Now it doesn't have a Masorah per se. It has been 5 centuries. Maybe it does, and so maybe that's what the Netziv says. So practically, Moshe Feinstein says that it's permissible to eat. The Nefesh Harav, Rav Schechter quotes that Rav Soloveitchik said that it was permissible to eat turkey at the end of November on the day of Thanksgiving. And we understood that in his opinion, there was no problem that turkey did not lack a tradition of kashrus and that eating on Thanksgiving, it was not a problem of imitating Gentile customs. Rav Belsky Zatzal also has a great piece in his Shulchan Halevi. You could read that as well. And he notes that some families do not eat turkey because there is no Masorah, but by and large, we're makel, and that again, we do need a Masorah because it's hard to know those 24 birds, what they are. It's hard, but we know for certain the turkey wasn't one of those 24 birds because it wasn't available then. So it seems likely that it could be okay. And so I would say, like, when we talk about turkey, on the whole, I think like there's a reason why people eat turkey, and probably strong legs to stand on. But I want to make 2 final points about this that I think are things to kind of chew on. The first point, and I don't want to get into it, and it's like another share for their time, is whether or not eating turkey specifically on Thanksgiving should be forbidden. In other words, eating turkey all year round, not a problem. But eating turkey on Thanksgiving, is that, by doing something, is that like, as Rav Schechter is quoting Rav Soloveitchik and saying, I'm not saying that Rav Soloveitchik was wrong, Tzatz v'Shalom, is that like Chukas HaGoyim, where we're imitating the Gentiles or not? Rav David Cohn felt that to eat turkey specifically, because it's like the holiday of Thanksgiving, probably maybe not good to do. And I've heard some have the tradition that like they'll just take a year off from turkey every 5, 10, 15 years. In other words, like as long as you don't do it all the time and you don't like treat it as something religious, so then, okay, like I like to eat turkey, and this is the day that like turkey's on sale and it's easy to get and all that, so I'm going to eat turkey. Okay, this year we didn't have turkey, we had something else. So I think there is something to think about and to chew about, no pun intended, when it comes to Chukas HaGoyim and when it comes to how we approach turkey on Thanksgiving. But the bigger question that I want to leave you with, to think about, is the notion again of how we approach new things. And Rabbi Slifkin, who's like the other Zoo rabbi, he wrote in one of his books, I want to read you something that I thought is really interesting. He says that whatever the explanation is, one thing is clear. If turkey was discovered today, there's not a kashrus organization in the world that would permit it. Turkey became accepted because there was a window of opportunity in which new species were discovered at a time when there was much less clarity about their origins and much less stringency in halachic practice. And I think this is like a really interesting thing for us to chew on, which is when we do encounter new things in the world, technology, or new species of animals, I don't know, fish, things that we've never seen before, how do we approach it? And how much of our Masorah and our heritage impacts our ability to digest, again, no pun intended, these complex issues versus how much do we take the path of least resistance and say, listen, we can't do it. This is just how things always have been. And how important is that for us as our community? And that tension, I think, is worth the struggle. So we'll stop here. And if you are eating turkey and you are celebrating Thanksgiving, wish you a happy Thanksgiving. And looking forward to seeing everybody really soon. Take care. Have a good night.